A huge thank you to the government of Egypt for hosting us here, and also to Resilience Hub partners who've sponsored this pavilion. Huge thank you for you all attending today as well. My name is Ben Webster. I'm Head of Secretariat with the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership, which is a coalition of governments, civil society, private sector, international organisations who are aiming to scale up early warning that leads to early action to make 1 billion people safer from disaster. And in order to make that happen, comprehensive climate and disaster risk management embedded into national policies, plans, legal frameworks is absolutely foundational and key for us to be able to move to scale, which is why I'm delighted to be moderating today's session with such an expert group of panelists who I will introduce in due course. But before I do, I would like to welcome colleagues from UNDRR and IFRC to set the scene for us, to explain what is comprehensive climate and disaster risk management, why it's so critical, and therefore, without further ado, allow me to introduce Tiziana Quarta-Bonzon, who is Manager of the Climate, Migration and Resilience Department at the IFRC, and also happens to be co-chair of our REAP Technical Advisory Group. Tiziana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ben. I'm sure everybody can hear me okay. So let's start with what is confronting humanity today. Millions of people, as we know, are falling back into poverty each year because of the shocks that range from both localized extreme events to major disasters that include drought, floods, storms, and epidemic diseases. Climate change, which we're discussing here today and during these next couple of weeks, and the unsustainable exploitation of the Earth's resources are making many people and ecosystems more vulnerable, thus increasing the scale and frequency of hazards. These risks collide, overlap, and compound vulnerabilities. We actually see a systemic pattern of risks with cascading crises that are eroding resilience and development gains across all sectors. And what we know is that this situation will only get worse. We will see that climate and weather events will increase in frequency, intensity, and disasters will become more complex and deadlier in the future. The IPCC has already recognized that climate change is already having humanitarian impacts. The losses and damages are happening, triggered by extreme climate and weather events. And we all know that we need to scale up action to increase our investments in building resilience and addressing vulnerability. We cannot afford to continue making risk-blind investments that ignore that these systemic risks actually result in countless lost lives and resources. Hence the importance of the topic that we will be discussing today. Comprehensive risk management is an approach that considers all types of hazards, alongside climate risks. And this has to be the approach that we need to integrate in our climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction planning processes. And it is also a component of efforts to avert, minimize, and address losses and damages. Such an approach requires that climate risk is considered alongside other risks, epidemics, social tensions, displacement, natural and environmental hazards, and all of the activities that we are implementing to reduce the impact of the climate crisis, they need to be risk-informed and climate smart to enable people to anticipate, absorb, and adapt to all types of shocks. So adapting to the rising and evolving risks from multi-hazards also requires urgent and substantial investments at local level, so that risk information is taken into account in assessments, improve understanding of risks through development of scenarios and drills, improving early warning and early actions, and mitigating risk through greater readiness and planning and design of activities. Of course, I represent the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and we believe that our national Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies can, and they are well placed to integrate this variety of risks in their humanitarian activities along the humanitarian and longer-term programming continuum, because they're there before, during, and after emergencies. What we need to take into account is that mainstreaming risk requires a collaboration from climate, development, and humanitarian actors. they really need to work together to achieve much greater coherence in planning, assessment, and design of interventions that aim at averting, minimizing, and addressing losses and damages. But also, responses to losses and damages require a much stronger integrated package of actions that has to be informed by this comprehensive understanding of risk, but also based on needs and capacities of the affected communities. These actions may include social protection, insurance pools, solidarity funds, as well as investing in early warning systems and the building blocks of anticipatory action. As you mentioned, Ben, it is absolutely important that this approach is also included in climate and disaster laws and policies. And this has to be mutually done. It has to be disaster considerations into climate law and policies and vice versa. So this is absolutely critical. But we need to do better at connecting people and stakeholders who take decisions that ultimately will impact on climate and disaster interventions. And we have to ensure the multi-sectoral and multi-risk assessments and planning takes place at all levels. Finally, I'd like to say that, honestly, it matters very little to affected people facing floods, crop losses, displacement, whether the situation they're facing is the responsibility of a climate agency, a development actor, or a humanitarian actor. So what we have to do is actually to keep people at the center of the decisions and the interventions that we are designing and implementing, and ensuring that they can meaningfully engage in understanding and then integrating the risks in the decisions that will ultimately affect their lives. Therefore, locally led action that is respectful of local realities and capacities and integrates this comprehensive risk management approach is very important along the resilience continuum. I'll stop here, and I really look forward to hearing from our speakers about the insights from different sectors and different parts of the world. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Tiziana. Thanks so much for starting to unpack this complex picture of colliding risks, but ensuring that we are focused on people at the very center. So to take this a bit further, I would also like to welcome to the floor Animesh Kumar, who is head of the Bonn office with UNDRR, and also happens to be co-chair of one of REAP's working groups focused specifically on comprehensive risk management. So thanks so much, Tiziana. Animesh, over to you to unpack this further for us.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Ben, and very glad to have this very excellent panel here. So there is a presentation, and as this presentation comes up, perhaps the panelists might want to turn themselves around or maybe sit in one of the seats in front. I think people on the sides, maybe they are well placed to still look at the screen. So I would just take forward what Tiziana has just mentioned in terms of the importance of a shared understanding of risk as the basis for integrated implementation. So what is comprehensive risk management? If you look at the Article 8 of the Paris Agreement, the only place where risk management word comes is in context of comprehensive risk assessment and management under Article 8, which is on losses and damages, and in context in particular on averting, minimizing, and addressing losses and damages.
Oh, sorry.
So
okay.
Just to look at the challenge, we all know that we are facing, the world is facing the growing reality of passing 1.5 degrees Celsius as we speak. And while we continue our efforts to reduce global house gas emissions and ensure that mitigation becomes stronger and stronger, we also need to prepare for a world which goes beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. And for that to happen, we really need to ensure that the disaster risk reduction community and the climate change adaptation community work together. But that is a challenge, and I'll come to that. But just to further understand why integration of risk is important for climate change adaptation, not only in terms of further understanding the complexity of risk, which is something the IPCC Working Group 2 report has highlighted, but also our global assessment report released in the mid of this year was also highlighting the same point, that risks are increasingly becoming more and more complex, cascading, interconnected, and it needs a whole of society and whole of government approach to be addressed. It cannot be employed or cannot be addressed by one specific ministry. At the same time, as we move forward, we are looking into the limits to adaptation and hence more and more losses and damages. And at the same time, risk-blind adaptation resulting in maladaptation. So the point at the end is that if we want to move forward towards the path of resilience, we cannot look at disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation from two separate lenses. But there are challenges in terms of employing such integrated approaches. One is the understanding of risk itself. The climate change adaptation community, the way they look at risk, or the way IPCC looks at risk, and the way the disaster management community looks at risk are often not the same. And this often results from the difference in timescales. Climate change often is about long term in the future, up to 50 years at times, while the disaster management community is actually informed by what they have already seen in the past or may see in the near future. This also results in terms of limited integration of the analytics. So risk analytics not being so much integrated into adaptation planning, and adaptation goals in a country not becoming the basis for disaster risk management policies and plans. At the end of it, all of it boils down to the institutional silos. Two different ministries working in their own, developing parallel plans, accessing parallel funding for activities which are so correlated to each other. And then when it comes to the sectoral implementation, this all falls apart. So what we are trying to do is, building upon the Paris Agreement context of comprehensive risk management and assessment, we are trying to build up a dialogue between the climate change community and the disaster risk reduction community for adopting more and more risk-centered approaches into adaptation planning and climate information, projections, and adaptation goals into disaster risk reduction plans and strategies, with the understanding that risk reduction cannot occur without the use of climate information, and climate change adaptation will not happen unless risk analytics are integrated into it. Let's look at some very good examples, and I think all of us are very much aware. 13 countries in the Pacific have already developed a joint national action plan or an integrated plan, which led to the formulation of the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific, FRDP, which brings together adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable development goals together at the regional level. And I think some of us may not be aware, but out of the 39 NAPs that have been submitted so far, there are 2, Kiribati and Tonga, which are actually those integrated DRR plans which have been officially submitted as NAPs on the NAP Central. So we do have something to build upon. This is where, I'm speaking more now from the disaster risk reduction hat. This is how we have been developing plans. We look at the past disasters, build up our hazard understanding, look into vulnerability, look into our exposure, and then build a plan based on that. Now, how does comprehensive risk management change this way of working? One, we'll look into how the observed changes in climatic patterns are happening and what the projected changes in the climatic patterns will happen. We translate these into potential impact, because unless we translate our climate informatics into potential impact, we cannot actually plan for it from the disaster risk reduction point of view. And that leads to more climate-informed DRR plan. That's our first step. Then we look at what the NDC vision of that country is, and in particular, what the adaptation goals are in that country. That further informs, making it a more integrated plan, because if we have the NDC on the one side, the climate informatics on the other side, the risk understanding on the other side, essentially we're talking about one integrated DRR and climate change adaptation plan. At the end, our vision is one country, one plan. It doesn't make sense to keep duplicating each other's efforts and look for different financing. And this is the approach, a programmatic approach that we have been employing together with different partners. We are establishing risk information exchange, which is one-stop shop for data in a country on risk. We are developing different technical guidance, providing capacity development support to countries, and backed by research and analysis, all of it underscored by partnerships like REAP, our UNFCCC engagements, Anticipation Hub, Ensure Resilience, and now Adaptation Action Coalition. These are some of the tools and products that have all come out in the last 1 year. The most recent one being the technical guidance on comprehensive risk assessment and planning, which has been endorsed by UNFCCC, will soon be reflected on the Warsaw International Mechanism website. The Green Book, which is also on the table in front of you, is on integrating DRR into NAPs. It also has been endorsed by UNFCCC and is already on NAP Central. So we have already taken some steps in terms of developing the knowledge to do so. And these are some other resources in terms of nature-based solutions and so on. Now, this panel is very important because where we are as of now, we are building a common shared understanding of risk as the basis of planning, but we are also facing challenges in terms of implementation. How do we transition from planning to implementation? How do we translate our common understanding of risk into implementation? And that's why we want to learn from you in terms of your sectoral perspectives, country perspectives, community perspectives, how we can strengthen this program further, and all of us can then join hands together to make more resilient world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Animesh and Tiziana, for setting the scene there. A very clear and comprehensive overview, and also a compelling case for one country, one plan. Why would we work in silos and do these separately if we can have a more comprehensive, overarching plan? So let's have two panel discussions to unpack this at the national level, at the regional level, at the community level, and also some thematic perspectives on this issue. So really delighted to have some expert panelists with us. And first of all, I would like to introduce Ms. Antonia Loiscada, who is Secretary at the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, or DENR, in the Philippines. Very warm welcome. Obviously, the Philippines is at the forefront of climate change and increasingly impacted by climate-related disasters. So how does the Philippines ensure that disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation planning processes are aligned? What does this look like in practice? And could you bring it to life for us with some examples, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I should say that, qualify the introduction. In my previous incarnation, Animesh and I worked very closely together because the Philippines works very closely with UNDRR. And I used to head the National Resilience Council, and precisely this is what we were trying to do, bring together a risk-informed development plan for the Philippines. Let me just start by saying that I may be the business case for Animesh's presentation, but the experience of the Philippines has really led us to focus first on exposure and vulnerability as the core of risk. And once you actually are able to unpack that vulnerability and exposure, you can begin to then anticipate the potential impacts of the different types of hazards that you actually face. The Philippines has the full menu, including climate change-related hazards and therefore risks. One of our strategies at the very outset is to actually have one APEX plan, and that actually has come out in Animesh's presentation. The Philippine Development Plan, as it's being crafted today, actually has a full chapter on climate change and disaster risk reduction, which intersects with other chapters in the development plan on water, infrastructure, public health, human security issues. And that APEX plan is, if you will, the fundamental document that guides all the different policy formulation of the different national government agencies in the country. And I think that that's one of the strongest points that I'd like to make at this juncture, that there must be an APEX plan. If we would like to work directly with local governments and communities, we can hope for incremental adaptation. We can hope for incremental change. But if we want to be transformative, this must be a whole of nation. This must be a whole of society effort. And so unpacking both the historical and the future hazards that might actually confront the Philippines really means that we need to accept that risk is part of development trajectories, human decisions that are making, in fact, and generating the risk, or actually reducing or averting the risk that we all face. So I begin with that then, reframing our idea of where disasters actually fall. They're not humanitarian events for us anymore. They are development decisions, and therefore they must be at the very core of the national planning process. We have the same issues in terms of parallel plans that are existing in the country. We have a national disaster risk reduction management plan. We have a national adaptation plan. We have, of course, the NDCs and the local translations of these and iterations at the local government levels as well. So we do have a vertical problem, and we do have a horizontal problem as well at the local level, but also at the national level, I should say, in trying to break down the silos of each of the government agencies that are working on climate and weather-related risks, and also other types of hazards that are being faced by our country. So the idea here is that at the very national level, there is a cabinet cluster a cabinet cluster for climate change adaptation and mitigation and disaster risk reduction. And that cabinet cluster group actually is in charge of assuring that there must be convergence in budgeting and planning. And in the budgeting sense, we actually have a tagging system for climate expenditures. We're now pushing that there must also be a tagging system for disaster risk-related expenditures so that they actually have the two covered in one particular initiative by each of the local governments and across the different national government agencies. Locally, we have regional development councils that work directly with the local governments. And there are local DRR or local resilience councils as well. These are typically multi-stakeholder, public, private, academe, CSO, and actually that conversation then permeates the planning process at the local level. So we do have an executive and legislative agenda setting process. There's an annual investment planning process. And at the very core of this now, as we are trying to push, are not only the local climate change adaptation plans and local disaster risk reduction management plans, but at the very core of those are what we call the CIDRAs, climate and disaster risk assessment tools, that they must base their planning process on. So we all expect each of our local governments to come up with their respective climate and disaster risk assessments. That's local. And then that gets, in fact, pushed upstairs to the overall climate and disaster risk plan nationally. I think at this point I will then just point out that, again, whole of society, whole of government. We have private sector partners, for example, that are investing in climate research, both for early warning, but also for the shift towards renewable energies in the country. These are private sector funders for research that, in fact, government is going to be making use of, and that local governments can actually access because this is available publicly. We also have a push for, in fact, ESG-related expenditures by corporations so that they're actually linked to specific climate and disaster risk for the local operations where actually they're situated. Finally, at the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, we are in charge not only of conservation and protection of natural resources, we also are in charge of extraction. So regulating extraction, particularly the mineral sector, is one of the sensitive areas in terms of development, but also one of those areas wherein the economy of the country is relying, in fact, for its recovery. So the department's challenge is really to work on both protection and extraction, and to do that responsibly, so that, in fact, we are able to manage all types of hazards, including climate and weather-related hazards. The department is in charge of water. It's in charge of landslide and flood management as well. And so at our very core now, we do have a climate risk lens that we have now begun to apply to all the department's work. So I hope that helps you in understanding where we are. It is a trek. We are still facing many challenges in terms of breaking down silos. But with that APEX plan and the different national and local government units working together, we think that this is quite possible, this comprehensive risk management approach.
Thank you so much, Antonio. Really valuable lessons learned, and I'm sure that's been hard-won gains over a period of time, but things that we can all learn from globally. So thank you so much for sharing those experiences, and interesting to hear this whole of government, whole of society approach, which is so important. Let's look at the regional level now as well, and there is an opportunity to ask questions for people in the room and those online as well. If you would like to ask questions, please hold on to them. Towards the end of the session, we'll have a chance to put questions to our panelists. But let me introduce Mr. Gakworth Kai, who works in the Disaster Risk Management Unit in the African Union Commission. For this regional perspective, we know that Africa is one of the continents most affected by increasing drought and floods in recent years, and as climate-related disasters will only increase in severity and intensity in the coming years, how is the African Union promoting coherence between disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation agendas, Mr. Kai, at that regional level?
Well, thank you, Ben. Good evening. 5 years ago, the African Union established unit on disaster risk reduction. And throughout the last 5 years, we've been observing trends on the continent. And I think 3 of them is stand out. First, we have seen a lot of interest in the implementation of DRR programs, as well as adaptation, as well as resilience as well on the continent. And this really is quite impressive compared to many years ago. We have seen several initiatives, on the continent, and we have also seen a lot of stakeholders joining on board, also through the Africa Working Group on Disaster Risk Reduction. That is one positive trend showing that there is a lot of interest in the area in recognition of the specific challenges facing the continent. The second characteristic that we have also observed on the continent is what I think Tanzania was talking about, is what we call hybrid risk, hybrid disasters. One disaster coexisting with so many in one go. And then you see you have flooding coming in one part of the country. The other part of the country is flooding. The other part is desert locust invasion. And then recently with COVID-19. Other countries with Ebola. And this does not only, they don't only coexist, but they only, they interchange from one season to another. And this does not allow time for recovery. So this is one characteristic, and it's becoming a norm. It's becoming normal at the current situation for the last 5 years. I think the third element that we have also seen is that despite all this intervention, we have been undertaking, several assessments. What we have observed is that despite all in this intervention, disaster risks keep increasing. And we try to ask ourselves, how can we explain all these interventions for several years, and yet vulnerability is rising, exposure is increasing, and coping capacity is declining? So how do you explain the mismatch between several interventions and increasing risk on the other part? And I think one of the suspects is that we may not be addressing the same problem. And one of these is that the silos approach may be one of the problems. And we think that the resilient thinking, ensuring that we adopt a systemic risk approach in addressing some of these, could be one of the solutions. And with this, we have come up with several interventions now at the continental level. Some of these are just taking off. We are now working toward developing an institutional policy, an African Union institutional policy that will make it mandatory for all AU programs to ensure that they have taken into account climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and other environmental considerations. And I think that policy will be a starting point to build institutional coherence and policy coherence. That is the first step. Over the past few months, we have been developing an Africa Urban Resilience Program. And that program also brings on board climate change adaptation and DRR at the same time. We hope to roll out the program next year. And already there is clear understanding that you cannot implement a resilient program without actually bringing on board climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. But thirdly, there is one thing we keep forgetting, because if you look at the way we are implementing DRR and climate change adaptation, they very much look at physical risk. And we leave the social component of risk. We have seen how climate change adaptation, you can have a very good project taking into account all climate change, or the DRR looking at physical risk. But at the end of the day, this project can create conflict. And creating conflict means you are also amplifying vulnerability. And you have more vulnerability, and then you are not addressing the problem itself, because vulnerability keeps increasing. And the more you have, vulnerability is antidote of risk. So if you don't address vulnerability, you cannot be able to so the social component is the driver of vulnerability. And I think it's important when we think of DRR and climate change, we also need to look at conflict. And there are several examples in recent days. Although I work with the African Union, I come from South Sudan, and we have one village that experienced flooding this year. Communities were displaced. These are pastoralist communities. They were displaced because of flooding, and then they moved with their cattle to another community, a farming community, and suddenly this created conflict because these animals went to the farmlands. And you could see a clear linkage between this physical risk and the social component. So I think the comprehensive risk management should also go beyond the DRR CCA nexus, but also including conflict as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kai. And yeah, really interesting to hear how these colliding risks need to be managed. No easy task in Africa. And I keep thinking how we all need to take this step back to see holistically, to see our small component in this wider picture. And I guess the truth is the same when you come down to community level. Communities don't care, how this is boxed or termed or framed. These are day-to-day risks that are faced. So let's look at the community level. I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Robert Kwesiga, who is Secretary General with the Red Cross Society in Uganda. And obviously the Red Cross is one of the key organizations helping to translate policies into practice on the ground, into local actions. And as in many countries, in Uganda, disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation portfolios are managed by different ministries within the government. So in Uganda, it's the Office of the Prime Minister and the Ministry of Water and Environment. So Robert, can you tell us about Uganda's experience in coordinating climate change and disaster risk reduction actions at the local level, and communities, how do they engage with these structures that are in place at the national level? Thanks, Robert.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good afternoon, colleagues. We always say that it starts and ends at the community level. And if you don't give due attention at the community level, most likely you will not succeed. And so in Uganda, we have made initiatives as to how we can strengthen the legislation, the policy framework, but also actions that are addressing the community level interventions, but how they link to the national dimensions. Now, Uganda is exposed to various weather or climate-related hazards. It rains, we get floods. It doesn't rain, we get drought. Human beings have invaded the space of the wild animals, and partly we expose some of these pandemics. Ebola, like currently we are in the middle of an Ebola operation. And so that context, it ties into what I've just said, that you must make sure that the people at the community, the policy framework that addresses the community-related interventions are put in place. And so the various government departments, coordinated by the Prime Minister's office, but also mainly the Ministry of Water and Environment at the center of this. Now, regarding the policy framework or legislation, so in 2021, the Red Cross played an active role in enabling this legislation coming in place. And how did we do it? We provided technical support, but at the same time, we provided advocacy. As we say, we made the noise in support of that legislation. And in this, various agencies, because it is multi-sectoral, you can't limit it to one ministry. So there was a whole question of bringing on board the various government departments, whether it is the Ministry of Health, because that's where pandemics fall, whether it is the ministry in charge of infrastructure, which is works, ministry to do with the social inclusion, which our friend has just mentioned, and then bring on board the community-based organizations and the private sector, because the private sector is a key player in all this. And so, as Red Cross, our central role as an auxiliary authority, that's how it was panned out. More so, in the support of the Prime Minister's office, we developed what we call the risk atlas for the country. And in this risk atlas, to know the mapping of what kind of risks and where are they localized. So now this is in place. Since 2020, this was put in place. And thereafter, we have been working with local governments. And Red Cross being given that mandate to develop what we call risk profiles and risk disaster plans for each local government. And these plans not only are plans on paper, but also on how we can simulate them in the case of these emergencies. We have also rolled out what we call area action tools. And these area action tools, they can be resilient houses, flood-resistant shelters, how to support communities in terms of developing, strengthening their livelihood mechanisms, putting in place what we call community radios. These are the ones we can use to tell the public that something is going wrong. You better either evacuate or you better take the necessary action. And more so, the whole question of strengthening what we call area action protocols. We have worked with the government, and this is in place. Plus, replanting trees, which, because until we make the countryside green again, then we can talk of all this, but we'll be addressing the symptoms, but not the cause. So, Mr. Moderator, by and large, this is work in progress, I would call it. But the framework, whether legislation and the procedure and the policies, including the National Disaster Plan, district, local government disaster profiles and plans are in place. The key challenge now is how do you make it work? And to make it work, the community must own it. You must get our information. And that's why the Red Cross also plays a key role. How do you get this our information? How do you translate it into action that benefit the public? How do you make even some of these scientific information? Take an example, weather forecast. I don't know your countries. If someone says you are going to receive high rains or moderate, to a common person, what does that mean? And how does this person prepare? Now, and all this happen, it goes hand in hand with how do you ensure financing and deliberately targeted in that direction. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Robert, for bringing that to life, these very practical tools and examples of how the policies, the plans, the legal frameworks can translate into action on the ground. So we've covered the local level, the national level, the regional level. Let's move on to some thematic perspectives. And on this second panel, we will have Mr. Ali Raza Rizvi, who's head of climate change within the Center for Economy and Finance at the International Union for Conservation of Nature. We have Mr. Martin Frick, who's director of the WFP Global Office in Berlin. And we also have Mrs. Liva Kokuri, who's Natural Resources Officer at the Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment at FAO. So, for this thematic perspective, perhaps Mr. Ali Raza, we can start with you. Ecosystems and nature-based solutions, these play a role in building resilience and mitigating the impact of disasters, and we hear a lot about nature-based solutions. Could you please give us some examples of the IUCN's work in this space? Are there good country examples that can help bring this to life for us.
Thank you. Good to be here. And let me start by business as usual is not working. We all know. Half the world is under floods, half the world is under heat waves, and all the fires and other things are going on. So what's going wrong? IUCN has been engaged in climate adaptation, and by the way, we have disaster risk reduction program, part of climate change already. So we have been working in over 100 countries. So I will share just the top of the gist of what is going wrong and share some of the anecdotal, some examples. But main thing is the gist is currently, whatever we are coming up with solutions, they are not working. We need to change. And how to change? So let's just first see things going wrong because we have, and as you also alluded to that, we are working in different dimensions. We have different lens. If we are getting funded, if we meaning the whole sector, we are all sitting here. If we have a project funded through climate change, we see the word only issue is the climate. If we have working in food security, we see only food security. Communities' problems, they are not that, they have resources, they have water, they have fields to work on, forest, and then all things which can be attributed to climate, or sometimes people think, okay, that's God-given if some water is extracted by big companies and other. So thing is that we need to have an integrated approach. Unless and until we have an integrated approach, we can have anecdotal, good examples. We can come and say, oh, great work is being done, but scaling up will not be possible. And that's what is happening. We have, all of us, I would say, with donors and implementing agencies, project-oriented approaches. Work is being done in a country or in a site, and that is for 3 years, 4 years, and then first year is spent on mobilizing resources, bringing everything there, and then 2-3 years we are all working and then wrapping up and going away for another project to implement. So things need to be taken into more from projects to programs. That is critical, and then we need to have country level integrated approaches, as you said, one plan, one country. Because if there are no integration going on within even our own organizations, we need to reflect. Because as I say, the current model is not working and it will not work. If we are bringing in ecosystem-based approaches, nature together with disaster risk reduction, adaptation, mitigation, all need to see the world, the problem with one lens. Because that's where, and again, many donors, when we speak to them, we also share with them, look, you have different windows. And I can give you real examples without naming names where things are going wrong. If you are doing mitigation, choice of species for REDD+, one choice of species or two fast-growing trees so that you can count all the carbon credits or things like that and claim that this much sequestration is taking place. And those even choice of species is not as per projections of the climate. Which species can survive in the next 5 years? So that's where ecosystems and nature comes in. You cannot do mitigation just planting trees. You need to see which species. In the last just 1 degree centigrade, around 11,000 species are at risk, and they are part of the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. Do we take into account these aspects when doing plantation? No. Do we even do our projects are data driven or science based? No. So these are the issues. Do we look into indigenous peoples, their knowledge, and how? End of the day, solution is that we need to have science-based, data-driven, integrated approaches with indigenous knowledge. But still, climate change is a moving target. You prepare communities, work with them for flood management. After 2-3 years, there would be drought for next 10 years. you work with drought management and all those species, which FAO has been doing a lot, how those can be done, there would be flooding. What happened in Pakistan? 33% of the whole country, 50 million people got affected. 50 million is more population than 150 countries of the world. So how to deal with climate? End of the day, technology also needs come into play. Together with nature, grey-green infrastructure, integrated approaches, we need to stop seeing the world. If I am ecosystem expert, I cannot see only with ecosystem lens. We need to work together. Cross-sectoral collaboration is needed. Science-based, data-driven, project-oriented approaches. Only project-oriented approaches will not work. They are not working. We need to educate donors that come out of project mode and then go into a programming with local governments. And we need to see if local governments, most of the 150 countries or 160 countries, they have infrastructure, they have staff, they have vehicles, and salaries only. No gas or petrol for vehicles, nothing to do. They are totally dependent on donors. So even if they know their area well, they know their local problems, they are driven by what the call for proposal thematic area is. They will develop it because they are dependent on that. So we need to reflect. Elephant in the room is, there's not just one, there are so many. We need to reflect if we need to move forward. Otherwise, it's too late. It's already too late for millions, and it won't stop here. So I'll stop here.
Thanks, Ali Reza. I mean, yeah, some real, tangible, concrete challenges and issues that we need to overcome if we're to achieve this comprehensive, holistic view. But great to hear the nature and environment perspective. We often focus on people, but people cannot be separated from their environment and from nature as well. I would like to look at food, because this is, a huge global challenge currently. We're all impacted by rising food prices and availability, and with the climate changing, there will just be, more and more problems in the years to come. So it'd be great to bring in WFP and FAO on this issue. Perhaps, Martin, we can start with WFP, but could you give us some concrete examples of how WFP is helping countries to increase resilience of their food systems, particularly relating to these more comprehensive risk management approaches?
Absolutely, thank you. And first of all, my apologies for being late. The only excuse I have is my total incompetence in orienting myself in an alien environment. And I wanted to say what I listened to was your intervention, and I could not agree more. And I'm stealing the elephant in the room from you, because in any kind of administration, be it the government, be it the United Nations, be it donors, what you do when an elephant comes your way, you basically think about whose responsibility is it. There's a health aspect, Minister of Health, you go. There's a youth aspect, there's the Minister of Youth, you are in charge. Minister of Agriculture, you are in charge. And they do their level best, but if you assemble what comes out of the machine, it doesn't resemble an elephant anymore. And I'm saying that because I'm happy to answer your question on food security and the food crisis. And heaven knows we are in the midst of a very dramatic food crisis. Between 2019 and now, we went up from 135 million acutely food insecure. And my FAO colleagues, they will say the number is much higher, and they are right. I'm talking about the worst level of hunger, people who actually acutely need help, and that went up to 345 million today. But in your spirit, I don't only want to look at food, 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 and neglect everything else, but I want to look at food as an indicator. The World Food Programme is an organization that typically comes in when everything else went wrong and people are hungry. But we are not only doing that, we are not only on the saving lives agenda, but on the changing lives. And that changing lives means for most people to survive the next crisis, to come out of it. And there are different ways of it. One, of course, is anticipatory action. In Bangladesh, when we knew that the flood is going to hit, we were handing out small amounts of cash to family so they could bring their cattle in security. And when they were coming back after the flood. They have lost a lot, but they didn't lose everything. In building long-term resilience, and to the topic of nature-based solutions, we need to see the interdependency because nature is complicated. If we look at trout only as a hydrological problem and believe we are building a dam or we are building a canal, it will fix it, it will not work. Water is in soils. Where you don't have soils, you don't have water. Where you want to build resilience against droughts, you need to make sure that there is albedo, that there is a tree cover. But also, when so often planting 1 million, 1 trillion, 1 gazillion trees is the climate solution, it doesn't work when it's one species, as you said, but it also doesn't work if it doesn't work for people. When smallholder fathers have a benefit from the trees, when they are becoming part of the food and the income system, then they can help building resilience, then they can mitigate the next crisis, and then they can diversify the basis on which they are living. And I want to conclude with that. I think the one thing to build resilience and to ensure that disasters don't strike so hard, locally but also globally, is diversify, diversify, diversify. We are getting 60% plus of our calories from wheat, from rice, and from corn. And this is on many, many levels just insane. If we go back to indigenous species, if we diversify our platform, if we base a diet in India on lentils, if we go to sub-Saharan Africa and we do more work on millet, on sorghum, on these things, then we are building the resilience that we need in the long run. Last sentence, 135 million 3 years ago, 345 today, a third of a billion. Take in addition 828 million people being chronically food insecure, and if you look closer and the reporting gaps, it might be closer to 1 billion. Look at the people who are malnourished, and you will see that this is a very stark indicator for the interdependent crises that we are facing today, of which climate is, and that sounds cynical, in an unpredictable future, maybe the most predictable next crisis.
Thanks, Martin. Really helpful. I mean, some huge obstacles and challenges to overcome, but some hope there in terms of practical ways that we might be able to start addressing these issues. And Martin started to touch on this systems approach. So from the perspective of FAO, Liva, the agri-food system is a good example of a systems approach to building resilience. Could you share with us, please, the challenges and opportunities in applying these integrated DRR and climate change adaptation approaches in this context? Are there any good practices identified from FAO's perspective?
Yes, so thank you for your question, and I'm very glad to be here, represent FAO in this panel and share our experience. So it shouldn't be news to anyone that agriculture, agri-food system and its value chains are heavily affected by the impacts of climate change. And especially the weather extremes that have been mentioned already are affecting the food systems and also increasing the hunger. And therefore, it's particularly urgent to help the most vulnerable and at-risk countries and communities who are affected by these climate change impacts and weather extremes to reduce, to prepare for the risks and prepare for the climate impacts, and also to build the resilience and the adaptation and strengthen their capacities towards long-term climate change impacts. Also, shouldn't be news that agriculture absorbs more than 27% of overall impacts caused by the climate disasters. So we have the facts that climate change is affecting food systems. But the most affected by these risks are small-scale farmers and producers who are securing 1/3 of the world with the food they produce. So they are the ones who are most exposed to the climate risks. And these are particularly the food producers and the farmers living in the countries already affected by the risks, such as conflicts, climate risks, food insecurity, and these are spiraling up and adding more risks to these communities. And this leads to the multiple consequences also to migration, displacement, poor livelihoods, worsening inequality, and increasing hunger, and the list goes on and on these consequences. And already, as Martin highlighted, we are facing acute food security crisis. It has actually been the hunger has been increasing actually since 2017, and it's rapidly steeping up. And this is by the studies done by FAO and the partner organizations. This is caused by the climate change, by conflict, by economic shocks, and still also by the global pandemic that we still continue to recover. And the UN Food Systems Summit reminded us that the global food systems are failing and they need to transform. And as an outcome, there are 3 alliances formed who are addressing transformation of the food systems and climate change. They are supported by Food and Agriculture Organization, and there is one particularly that I would like to highlight is the Climate Resilient Food Systems Alliance as well. And they are addressing multiple entry points on transforming food systems. But here in FAO, we've been saying for years that agriculture, agri-food systems need to transform. They need to transit from the sector that is contributing to the climate change and shifting to the sector that is providing solutions, but at the same time also providing food security and equality and well-being for all. And already as highlighted as well, this can only be achieved if we put the small-scale farmers, producers, foresters, fishermen at the center of this transformation and give them incentives to make this transformation, to make food systems more resilient and make this more systematic approach. And that's due to the fact that in most of the developing countries, 80% of the food is produced by small-scale farmers. So therefore, we need to put them at the center. So for this, and based on the work that we've done in the countries that are affected by multiple risks, the lessons that we have learned in FAO is that we have to ensure that the small-scale farmers and producers have access to the innovation, to the technology, but also that they have capacities to apply these new technologies to prevent impacts of climate change and be more resilient to these risks. There's also a need to invest in the technology because there are still a certain limit of the current solutions that exist. So the new, the science and the technology needs to be developed that then can be implemented on the ground. Then obviously the climate finance and climate risk finance is a huge gap, and it mainly focuses on responses to the disasters, where it should be more focusing on the preparedness and investment in the prevention, anticipation, and adaptation. And in that way, we can also strengthen the capacities of resilience towards the long-term impacts of climate change. So these would also not only apply to the food systems, but also the systematic change that all sectors need for the resilience. And in FAO, we support countries by blending the disaster risk reduction and also climate change adaptation. So it's more known as a disaster and climate risk management. And we apply the practices that are at the regional, at the national, subnational, and the local level based on local circumstances, and looking into the practices of agroclimatic and disaster risk information systems, early warning systems that trigger also anticipatory action, disaster risk governance, and many others. We have established this disaster and climate risk management facility that is mobilizing climate finance, but also promoting, enabling environment for knowledge exchange for countries to share their practices. And we strongly believe that if we together start to develop assured, well, clearly we are experiencing crisis. So if we have a shared narrative on resilience and climate adaptation to manage multiple risks, we can address this in a more systematic way throughout all the sectors. And the last, what I would like to mention is also make a reference to the initiative of the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action and Race to Resilience, who have developed this joint narrative that is focusing across these transformative changes and strengthening resilience for all sectors. And this has been developed by state and non-state actors, civil society, cities, regions, governments, businesses, and this is the narrative that has been agreed in this in this space. So that's something that we're also trying to integrate in the work and narratives of FAO to secure transformative and adaptive and resilient food systems. So with that, I would like to conclude. Thank you.
Thanks, Liva. Thank you for setting out some of the challenges, giving us some of the solutions. I think we can hear there is energy at COP to address some of these challenges, to see some change. So we do have some time left before the end of the session. We'd love to hear what your questions are. I'll see if there are any questions online, but are there questions in the room too? We have a fantastic panel of experts who are accumulating knowledge from around the world. So it would be good to put some questions to them. And we'll see if there are any online as well. So we have got some online. Let's bring in our online audience first, and then I'll come to questions in the room. Martin, could you pass the microphone? Thank you. Go ahead.
This is working? All right. I have a couple of questions online. Hi, everyone. My name's Kirsten, and we are receiving the messages online. So the first one is actually from somebody called Celine to our colleagues from the Philippines. So thank you for a really excellent presentation. And she has asked, can we have representatives of frontline communities in these national and local resilience and adaptation platforms that you've mentioned? And she adds, Philippines has a track record of working with local communities, institutionalizing the relationship between these local groups and national and local government and universities and other knowledge brokers and actors will improve the quality of what the Philippines government is already doing, because your frontline communities have lots of experience on the ground. And then the second question I have from online, if I'm allowed to ask too, is from someone called Aloysius, who is asking specifically about any interesting examples in building disaster preparedness, risk reduction and resilience, so comprehensive risk management, from community and subnational levels in countries from Asia, Africa and Arab states, and in particular from African cities and smaller towns. And he goes on to add, how do we sustain and make routine some of these pilot projects, and how do we reach locations when these projects end? Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Kirsten, for reading those out. Should we come to the question about the Philippines first? So, Antonio, how do you want to respond to that particular question?
At the local level, there are local disaster risk reduction management councils, and therefore the local governments are actually mandated to include all sectors in those councils in order to help them in crafting their annual investment plans, their annual investment plans and their programs moving forward. The National Resilience Council in particular, and there are other organizations as well. There's the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation. These are private sector funded, actually, organizations, but work precisely to bring together the different sectors, private sector, academia, local government, international development partners, I should add, CSOs and communities as well, in crafting this localized disaster risk reduction and climate risk management plans. So there is a structure to bring in community representation at the local level. At the national level, the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council actually has CSO representatives on that council and academe as well on that council. And so at the national level, excuse me, there already is a space for the different sectors. Thank you. Should I ignore this? Yeah. Yes. So there already is a space at the national level and at the local level. What is the challenge, I think, is basically to include those who... Very good. Those who are marginalized in a very, very specific way. Because often those people, they will not have a voice even in the local processes. And this is where the CSO community is particularly important in making these representations for those that are marginalized in a very, very specific way and would never be able to reach the local governance units as well as the national government as well. So CSOs in the Philippines have a very, very strong presence and a very loud voice, I should say, in terms of legislation, policy formulation, development, but also in the course of representing the marginalized.
Thanks so much, Antonia. Are there any of the other panelists who want to come in on this one, or also how we move from pilot projects at community level to scale? You know, we can hear young people at COP27 wanting to see change and to really see the scale up, the urgency required to meet the challenges. Are there any other examples or responses that panelists want to bring? Martin, go ahead.
If I may, if I may, I made in the first intervention this example of Bangladesh, where advanced payments enabled the farmers to bring their family and their cattle in security. What it does is the trigger points, when do we reach the moment when these cash payments are being released, is something which is being discussed with the communities ahead of time. And that alone is a very strong disaster risk reduction tool, because it triggers a discussion on community level. When do we believe a disaster is strong enough? And following from them, what do we believe is our personal threat situation? And that discussion is a helpful one. If you think in terms of flooding, what areas are low-lying? Where are we on higher ground? If you think on storms, where is the shelter? How far is that shelter? And I think this combination of anticipatory released payments, but a discussion with the community, where are the triggers to release these payments, are a very good combination. A, to help in case of a disaster striking early ahead of time, and progress in technology helps us to know 36 hours before a flood is coming. But it also helps people to become more risk-minded and better understand and mitigate their risks in order to have as much benefit from these payments as possible, because it's clear that you cannot release these payments, you know, every second week.
Very quickly, an example from Uganda, where we worked with the communities, and they had in Mount Elgon area where landslides, and there is in-migration. Very few countries where in-migration also in some countries is taking place. So Uganda, Mount Elgon is that area. So a lot of pressure on local resources, some conflict also, and landslides. So where we worked with them in an integrated manner for micro level credit programming and natural resource management, and then risk reduction element. So that went so well. Now that is working transboundary also, the Mount Elgon and the Kenya and local. And a good thing about, which is a good indicator, is that Ugandan government gave their own $500,000, which is very rare. Mostly it's all donor dependent, to continue with that. And now local governments are working on that. So that's very critical. Again, based on our experience, micro level or pilot scale projects got scaled up when three elements, if they can go hand in hand: ecological, social, and economic. People are not concerned about, something go happen, in likelihood of something happening as we speak in climate terms of 10 years, 20 years, here and now, So that if we can tackle tangible economic benefits with ecological restoration for sustainability and risk reduction, then things sustain.
Thanks, Ali. And yeah, really important point around the political economy. What are the drivers? What are the incentives to affect change? Let's take some questions from in the room. I believe we've got one from Sophie here and then two more over this side of the room. Go ahead, Sophie.
Hi, everyone. My name's Sophie Rigg. I'm a climate advisor at ActionAid. And my question is about what was brought up earlier around bringing together the national adaptation plans with national DRR plans and the importance of having that integrated approach. And we heard from the Philippines some of the really interesting work that you're doing at that governance level with your cabinet cluster and bringing that together. And I'm just wondering what you want to see from the international community and here at COP27 that can support that work and that integration. So yeah, specifically bring it back to sort of here we are at COP27.
Thanks, Sophie. Thanks, Adesi. Yeah, one at the front and then one further back.
Hello, my name's Pippa. Thank you so much for a fantastic discussion. So a number of times we heard about the elephant in the room being we have to address issues with a totally ecosystemic approach. It was really great to hear that theme. In a world where we're having more and more focus on sort of projectization and decision makers often don't have all of the knowledge, how can we try and scale that thought process, particularly to national leaders? So how can we scale that ecosystemic thought sort of away from our current lens, which is projectization, know what you're investing in? Have we got any thought on the panel of how we could do that and what you'd advise ministers in different policies to try and mainstream that process?
Thanks so much. We'll take one more question and then I'm looking for volunteers to take on these questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, hello. I'm Raul Fretes. I'm a PhD student. And there's something that from Mr. Ali that resonated me a lot with what I do and regarding how it's the difficulty to inform stakeholders regarding the importance of disaster risk assessment and monitorization of all these processes. And I want to ask, since the complexity regarding the disaster risk reduction management, do you have any examples of how can, as you have stated, we may educate or may provide tangible information for those stakeholders that provide action, so they may take a bigger role within this important area?
Great, thank you so much. So, question one, what do we require from COP27? You know, how do we take these approaches, scale them up? What do we need right here? Kai, I'd be really interested to hear from the African Union perspective. This is, you know, an African COP. So from your perspective, what do we need out of this one? But if we have other volunteers as well to come in on this one. Thanks, Karen. Kai, do you want to go first?
I think I have the mic, right? It's working? Yeah. All right. Well, our expectation is that I think there is entry point already, and the loss and damage discussion could be an important entry point to build a strong coherence between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And we are quite excited that the loss and damage is now in the agenda, albeit very, very late. But I hope we wait for a breakthrough, really, in this COP. And we believe there is a need for international community to work together to strengthen loss and damage, not only to respond to ongoing losses, as we are witnessing on the continent, but also as an entry point to strengthen the nexus between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction.
Thanks, Kai. Are there any other requests, strong demands of COP27 that, Liva, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, well, I don't think it can be, to be frank, I don't think it can be achieved by COP27, but I think to address more integrated approaches for disaster risk reduction and for adaptation, national adaptation plans, we need joint metrics, and that's something that can be addressed at the international level. So one of the aspects is also not putting more burden on countries for reporting and looking into sustainable development goals, also Sendai framework, and the UNFCCC reporting mechanisms and how we can integrate that, and that also then naturally would integrate these different policies that are as a solution, but sometimes also a burden to national governments at national level. So I would say yes, joint kind of reporting mechanism that helps to integrate,
If I could just, on your point, what to expect, again, for 27 years we are discussing. So that in itself we can see how, what we can perhaps do is to have more partnerships. One organization cannot do everything, you know. And again, we need to, because specialists are needed, but one organization or other, so partnerships are critical, and not diverse groups need to come together. It's not that the conservation organizations coming together to handle. No, we need humanitarian organization, mainstream development organization, conservation organizations to come together. We have started doing it. For example, with IFRC, we are going into an MOU to work and to build upon DRR expertise to bring in conservation and natural resource management. So one is about partnerships. We are working very closely with CARE International, Mercy Corps to look into loss and damage from all three angles of socio-economic and ecological aspect, how to address those. So I think those are the critical thing. And coming back to UNFCCC, I think we also need to bridge gaps between UNFCCC, CCD, and CBD, because all these problems are interrelated. Now, if the IPCC report says that climate crisis and biodiversity crisis are jointly, so they need to be addressed jointly also. So it's not that we just identified a problem. So what next? That we need to bridge these dots which are elsewhere.
Sure. This was a popular question. So, Robert, do you want to go first, and then Antonia, and then Martin?
Yeah, thank you. Mine is just a simple statement that, you know, some years back, I think almost 7 or 8 years ago, under the UN umbrella, there was a whole discussion, and one of the resolutions was the localization agenda. And when you look at all the COP resolutions, they are not yet fused into the localization agenda, especially when we talk of community resilience and community action. Can we turn the COP 2027 to link up and buy into the localization agenda? Well, that's when we are going to have the concrete results, other than always leaving it at a broader level without trying to look at what works at the community and who is best suited to make it work at the community. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Go ahead, Anthony.
Thank you. Thank you. This is work. Yes. So I guess just 2 words. The first word is intersectionality. We don't talk enough about how different kinds of vulnerability intersect. And therefore, the solutions that we're trying to design need to be solutions that have value to the different types of intersections between the different dimensions of vulnerabilities, of communities, of ecosystems, of infrastructure, if you want to bring that in. So intersectionality is something that I don't hear in these conversations. The second one is agency. We talk a lot about partnerships, but what we really need to be building is agency on the part of the vulnerable communities and supporting them in acting and being able to act on their own, to organize themselves and to actually form capital that they can actually use to alter their trajectories of vulnerability. That's all right. And so as far as I'm concerned, these are the two words that I haven't heard yet. Perhaps it's early days in the COP, but intersectionality and agency as a way to actually break the cycle of risk, whether it's from climate-related hazards or other types of hazards that actually interact with each other. And perhaps there might be room to actually expect some change in that conversation.
Go ahead, Martin. Do you want to build on that?
Very shortly. I would hope that leaders understand here that the current food crisis is not going to go away quickly, and that this is an indicator for a lack of resilience. Because if we had more resilient food systems, we wouldn't be in this situation. And food and bread is always most political. Think about the Arab Spring. This is a question of hard political stability. So this has to be a leader's issue because it can create political instability interiorly, and it can even create conflicts, while conflicts also fuel food insecurity.
Thanks, Martin. You hold on to it for now. The second question was, how do we move away from this projectization approach? So we're hearing a lot about these comprehensive approaches, but at the same time, we're moving towards more siloed, projectized approaches. So practically, what are the ways that we can buck the trend and develop longer term investment, resilience approaches, less projectization? Any specific recommendations on that front?
As I said, so if I can just very quickly, for that we all need to work together with the donors first, because whatever we say, most of us are donor dependent. In taking these things, we like it or not, we are. So, but donors also, they develop their projects and the duration based on the feedback we give. We need to reflect together with them. I will give examples of German ICI. They started in 2010, 9 and 10, and then on average, the project duration was 3 to 4 years, and around 2.9 million to 3.2 million. So after a long of time, we did share together with, colleagues which are working. There is a working groups in different, network, which is one FIBA. So we shared with them and others that, look, 3 to 4 year project, if you want sustainability or exit strategy, we are all smart people. We can do a very good exit strategy report and all that. This is the sustainability indicator. These are the proxy and all this. But in reality, as I said earlier, first year is spent on mobilization. Number 2, 3 years in implementation. 4th year, you have to wrap up everything. Sustainability, give us a break. If you really want sustainability, go to at least 10, 12 years project, work from 3, 4 million to 30, 40 million. And yes, they agreed. So about 2 years, 3 years back, they revised their whole strategies. And again, we are not the only, I said, a group of people, we all, have power if we can come with evidence. So they changed it. Now their duration are 8 to 12 years. Their funding mechanisms have gone from, this to 20 to 30 million. And same now, Canadian also came into play. They have put 1 billion on nature-based solutions. Their duration is still less, but they have gone for 30 to 40 million. So these are the things, if we go with evidence, all of us who are here, who are working, donors, so that's one thing. And second, from pilot project, there are thousands of case studies, good pilots, but scaling up becomes because we work like in a lab. We are going there with experts sitting here or in universities and international organizations like us and other. We develop a project, we hand over to regional office hand over to country office hand over to NGO hand over to community-based organization, they hand over to village organization. Are we transferring the technology? Are we transferring the institutional strengthening or the education required to make this? No. We just use those communities to develop our project proposals, make the progress report, and go for another proposal. So there is the thing, we need to do reflection very ruthlessly where things are going wrong. And second, the pilots are non-replicable. If we are doing, communities work and the worth is 50,000, communities don't have $50 extra. And we are talking about, okay, this is a project where we spend 30,000 and this is the great work we have done. No, let's be ruthlessly reflective and do postmortem of our work. Again, I'm using the word sector, but there are so many sectors. This is perhaps the only sector which is no post-project reflection is done. Only a glossy lessons learned report is done. In medical, if something goes wrong, they do postmortem of their work. At the other industry also, private sector. We love to talk about bringing in private sector. Are we practicing private sector's practices? No. So replicability, cost effectiveness, indigenous knowledge, and then donors together with it to support it.
Thanks, Ellie. It's a good place to start bringing us to a close. The last question was bringing us back to actions. So I'd like to hear from each of you. Leave a heads up. We'll start at the far end. But one action, I mean, this is a broad topic. It's complex. It's multi-layered. But what's your one action that our audience need to take away? What's the priority action that we need to take out from this discussion to move forward to more comprehensive, holistic approaches? So, Leva, one action from your side, from FAO.
I think one of the highlights, what I mentioned, is really moving away from reacting to the disasters, but more focusing the finance on preparedness and building that resilience. And that's across all systems and not the only food systems. No, it's the aspects what I mentioned about the climate finance. So.
Thanks, Leva. Robert, from your side?
Yeah, thank you. I think the key to me is investing in the other action. Either way, we win. Whether the emergency happens or the disaster happens, or it doesn't happen, which would be the wish, either way we win, because that investment would have gone into strengthening the capacities, the systems, the infrastructure. And if we can do it in a coordinated manner, and if this can come out clearly in COP27, that would be another landmark moving forward.
Thanks, Robert. Antonia?
For myself, unpack systemic risk and invest in prevention.
Good message. Okay.
Yeah, as all said, we need to have integrated approach, and preparedness is critical. Still 90% of the funding in I'm talking about disaster context, is going into disaster response, not in preparedness. And there are studies by Swiss Re and other, if, for example, $1 spent have a benefit of 8 to 10% even, or 10 times. So that's critical. Preparedness is the key in disaster, an integrated approach.
Thanks, Ellie. Martin?
I think we need to do everything to bring the discussion about preparedness on the most local level. This is where the action is happening, and often to trickle down national government, subnational government, community just takes too long. So we need to hear the voices from the ground and bring that debate to the community, because this is where simple measures can prevent a lot of damage.
Thanks, Martin. And Kai?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think we need to invest in institutional arrangements. Probably we need to have strong legislation or institutional SOPs that motivate different sectors to work together. And I think we also need to stop unnecessary invention, as I call it, because we tend to create new names that mean the same thing, and it becomes very difficult when we are doing implementation. And this should start from all of us, from the UN. UN has a very good way of creating all these mechanisms. And they really create problems at local levels. And it's not only UN, it's all of us, even for us in the African Union. So I think we need to stop this unnecessary invention that are creating a lot of difficulties when it comes to implementation on the ground.
Thanks, Kai. So we've looked at global, regional, local policy, practical implementation, real ringing endorsement for these comprehensive approaches. Thank you so much to UNDRR and IFRC for organising this event. Thank you so much to our expert panelists for contributing to unpacking this topic for us and giving us some practical insights and recommendations to move forward. And thank you to all of you for joining us, for your questions, for your insights. We hope that you enjoy the rest of the COP schedule, and yeah, we look forward to continuing this conversation as well. Thank you so much.